I am Cherie Burton, and this is the premiere episode, yay, of The Soul Rose Show. The Soul Rose Show is where ancient wisdom meets the modern path of soul evolution. The sacred feminine is powerfully on the rise. You might say she rose. Soul rose has a dual meaning, the verb rose, kind of for like the past tense of rise, and also rose for its divine feminine symbolism. This archetype of the rose and its mystical rose path have so many layers of beautiful meaning. There's also a deeper symbolic meaning of the blue that you'll find in my new images. Because the blue rose is the most mystical of all roses, it's also associated with healing, alchemy, magic, and enlightenment through devotion. Devotion to what, you might ask? Well, deeply to your own soul, to the divine, in the way that you define it. One of my teachers explains the blue rose as a symbolic record keeper of our original feminine blueprint and DNA. So these are the kinds of mystical things I've been exploring, researching, traveling, writing about. But I do have a background in mind-body science. And so that's kind of why I'm morphing this podcast into more of a science meets spirituality approach. So it's kind of like practical meets priestess. But yeah, my calling will always be about empowering women to heal, reclaim their sovereignty, radiate their sacred beauty. So the Soul Rose Show is that intersection between science and spirituality, between the ancient and the modern, because these are interesting times, very, very interesting times. So you can continue to follow me on Instagram at cherie.burton. Oh, and also please ask to join our revamped private Facebook group. It used to be called Stand Speak Shine Community. So if you remember that, you're still in, but it's now called the Soul Rose Community. And I'm doing free live mini classes on the second Monday of every month inside that group. And there's also going to be a lot of bonus content and interactivity. So make sure you ask to join that private Facebook group. And yeah, alrighty. So, well, with all that said, I hope you're ready to go wild with today's topic, connecting body and earth for wild wisdom. I want to introduce you to HeatherAsh Amara. You might recognize her name from her wildly popular best-selling book from 10 years ago, Warrior Goddess Training. I read this book when I was sort of in the initial stages of my unraveling / sacred feminine awakening, and it was a really powerful read for me. HeatherAsh is actually the author of 9 books. In fact, she has a soon-to-be-released book called Wild, Willing, and Wise. And what I love about her work is that she helps women shed limiting domestication. Yes, we've been domesticated, so that they can ground into their self-intimacy, steadiness, and stillness. So in this episode, we explore the heart of wild wisdom, what it means to kind of hone in on the deep, profound connection between your body and the earth. We're also going to share some practical insights on grounding yourself into nature. HeatherAsh, I'm so grateful that you're joining us today. It's just, as I was kind of feeling into this interview, having just barely met you, literally, but knowing of your work, I was like, what can we bring into this discussion that would deepen into the why around why you're doing what you're doing and just the evolution of your voice in the space of feminine empowerment. And I know it's very trite to say it's just about feminine empowerment, but anyway, welcome. It's just beautiful to have you.
Thank you, Cherie. It's so good to be here.
Yay.
I'm so happy.
Well, let's start with this book. And those of you watching on YouTube, I'm just holding it up, Warrior Goddess Training. It is from 2014, which actually I look at 2014 as the initiation into my personal dark night of the soul. So I didn't become aware of the book, though, until about 3 years ago. One of my friends was like, you should get this book. I want to kind of start there. Now that you've explored this in other discussions, sort of how you started with this and how it gave rise to now there's a whole deepening into what this was actually about, this warrior woman archetype, if you will, or the wild woman or what have you. So maybe just give us a little highlight reel of that coming out versus now we are 9 years later and what that's about for you.
Yeah. It's amazing. That book's been out for 9 years.
I have a daughter born in 2014.
My
and
God.
So that whole, for me too, the whole 9 years since she came along and kind of, anyway.
Time is amazing. That book, it's an interesting thing because that book came out of a live program that I used to do when I was really young. And it was something that was like an apprenticeship program where I pulled people together. And then I moved across the country and at that time, the people I was working with were like, do something on the phone. That was like way before Zoom and we were doing video stuff. And so I was like, all right, let me try to write a program and see if we can do something on the phone. And that's where the 10 lessons of Warrior Goddess training came out of, actually, was feeling into what could I translate that would help this group of people over a year period of time. We worked together for 12 months. And what's interesting for me, it's like the oldest program that I created and that I've been sharing that then got translated into a book. But at the time that book came out 2 years before, I had, we could say, my dark night of the soul, where my whole life completely fell apart. That my husband and I split and stopped teaching together. And it was just it was very messy and very painful. And my publisher at the time was like, okay, what's your next book? And I'm like, I don't have anything. Like
I'm
and
living
he's
the
like,
book
well,
right now.
I'm like, there's no book in me. And he's like, well, what have you written already? Send me something you've written. And I sent one thing and he's like, this isn't it. And then I'm like, well, I have this program for women. And he's like, send that to me. And that he's like, this is it. And so just to have that book come out of such a deep rip in my life and then transform into really finding my voice in a new way is how I would say it. And to be able to hold myself through that really, really hard time. And what I learned with that book coming out and being with what I was processing at the time is really not to abandon myself no matter what.
Mm.
Because there was this stretch that happened of my own personal going into a really deep healing and then the book blowing up.
Because it did blow up. Wasn't it like bestseller all over the place?
It was bestseller for 4 years in 2
Mm.
categories on Amazon, and yeah, it completely shifted my life
Mm.
and stretched me in so many incredible ways, and it was a very challenging time, but now looking back, I'm so grateful
Mhm.
because I am so much more compassionate, gentle, wider, deeper than I was before
So
that
you like
experience.
using
Yeah.
those gestures of like stretching, like
Mm,
expanding, like so painful. When you're in it, you don't have the semblance of awareness of what is actually happening. And it is an alchemical process. So that book came out in 2014. And again, I became aware of it a few years ago where my friend was like, you need to get this. And I have a couple of things highlighted, but I'm also there's two things. So I'm really, really interested about your connection to Don Miguel Ruiz. Many know him as this Toltec wisdom teacher. But then also, I want to talk about now you're moving into deepening into this other, really exploring women's wisdom. I think your next book is going to be called Wide, Willing, and Wise. And I'm interested in those choice of words. Well, let's start with Don Miguel, and then you can take us through that journey.
yes. So I was like talking about the feminine and the rise of women and serving this transition I believe that we're in of women really finding their power. And before Warrior Goddess came out, before I met Don Miguel, I was part of a goddess community, which I loved deeply. And I was teaching women's empowerment. And there was a point within the community where I realized we're missing something. Like something's not. I didn't have the language for it. I just had this sense of like, there's something that we don't quite have yet. And so I did a big prayer and I was like, all right, I don't know what we're missing, but help me find it so that I can bring it back to my community. And literally a week or two later, I had a dream. And in that dream, this powerful shaman human shows up and just looks at me. And I was like, oh, okay, that's the next step. And I woke up and I'm like, right, where am I going to find this person? I live in a tiny town in Northern California. And another week later, someone came into my office and said, oh my God, you have to meet this man. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Don Miguel.
Wow.
I didn't meet him for a year after that. Like I
How old
wasn't
is he
ready.
now? Like, do you know how old he is?
He's 70. Yeah, yeah. He just turned 71. Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah, and
Wow.
he's basically retired. He had his second heart transplant in December.
Wow.
So yeah, yeah. He had a heart transplant, I guess, 12 years ago, and then just had his second one. So
So
he's
that
hanging
was,
with his grandchildren and mhm.
yeah, I had his four agreements and something like it's like a sacred text. I mean, it's
It
amazing.
is.
So that
It
became
is.
like super New York Times bestseller, like the whole thing. What did he come in to show you? Like you said, you had this community of women who were on this kind of goddess path or the warrior and kind of letting their power rise and giving that permission. But there was this element that was missing. So what did he bring into that for your work?
What he brought in, I feel, is to that goddess energy is the warrior and the clarity of looking at old agreements and pulling the energy out of those old agreements so that we can let our natural connection to the divine come through. And so what I really got from Miguel was the recognition of we're not broken, there's nothing that needs to be fixed. And then a lot of like I had gotten stuck in this kind of empowered victim mentality, and I'd seen that in my community of
Yeah.
like, you will never let anyone, nothing, nobody's ever going to abuse me again. And it wasn't healed. And so to realize how much agreements and layers that I had, and to learn the tools to uncover, to come back into relationship with the divine, myself, my intuition. That's really what I got from Miguel. That, and I'd say like that warrior, and then also a model of pure unconditional love.
Wow. I'd have
Yeah,
never met him, but that's what's coming out of the pages
yeah,
of his
yeah,
book. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And I met him before there was a book.
Mhm.
So we would, I remember him teaching us about the four agreements. And so it was a very small group of us, and nobody knew Miguel at that time.
Mm.
And so to get to journey with him and his explosion and transformation of that book coming into the world, and to get to watch the teachings, which are, still so dear to my heart. I still use the four agreements every single day,
Yeah.
going out into the world. And there's a way that my mission has been taking those Toltec teachings that are based out of Mexico and Central America and bringing them through the lens of the feminine, and
Mm.
how we as women can integrate them
Yeah, when
in
I
each.
hear the words together, warrior goddess, I think sacred masculine meets sacred feminine. Not that the feminine is not a warrior, because she is, and not that the masculine's not nurturing or embodied and full. And it's just those choice of words together, I think, are really powerful. So when this book was circulated, the warrior goddess training, and it was out in the world, and you were still, learning and growing as we always are. I mean, I just look at the last 9 years on the planet and I'm like, oh my gosh, COVID and all the things. And there's just a lot coming out right now in the collective about unhealthy groups, charismatic leaders gone south. There's a lot of shadows that are being revealed and coming up to people's awareness. I have a sense that might have something to do with how your work is progressing. I look at my last 9 years and it's definitely about that. But yeah, so bring us into sort of like when you started working on this other project and what you learned between the two spaces.
Yeah, because it was definitely a COVID project. And it's funny because I started writing another book, and one day I'll publish it, but it's a memoir, and it was about the end of my relationship and like what I learned. It's a really intense, really intimate book. And there just came a point where a friend of mine was walking me through putting that book in the world. And she was like, "Are you sure you want to put this book into the world right now? Like, this is a heavy, intense book. And I'm not sure we need more heavy, intense books, or that you need to put out a heavy, intense book." And I was like, you're right. Let's do something different. Like, what do people actually need? And so I started just exploring, where are we now and what do we need
Mm,
as women, especially, because that's my focus. I mean, I'm definitely open to working with all genders, and there's a particular love of helping women find their power and their voice. And so as I dreamt into it, what arose was the archetypes of maiden, mother, and crone, and how important those three are, not as a line, which sometimes we think about them of like, you have your maiden phase, and then you have your mother phase, and then you
yeah,
have
they're
your
not so linear.
so linear, right? And you graduate from them. And I wanted to bring it back into the circle, which is how they were intended, that they're not a line, that we are learning how to be in relationship with these different energies and archetypes.
Mhm.
And so I started writing about that, and as I got into the writing, I recognized that I wanted to take it out of gender, and I wanted to take it out of any of the stereotypes of maiden, mother, crone, because I had people like, "I don't like the word crone,"
I know.
or
It's so
"I'm not a
triggering for
maiden
people. Mhm.
anymore."
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I'm like, "All right,
And some people
let's
are
come."
like, I don't resonate with the mother because they don't have children, even though they don't really understand that that's not even about, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
But it's not about
it's
that. Yeah.
muddy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I love the words that we came up with of wild, of finding that exploratory, curious, passionate, creative, like, let's try, calling that energy back. And also looking in our lives at the places that we're out of balance with wild, where we have an excess of wild or where we
Mhm.
have a deficiency of wild,
Hmm.
and learning how to find what would best serve us now. That there isn't a, and then I say this about warrior goddess too. It's not like I'm going to be 50% warrior and then I'm going to be 50% goddess and then I've nailed it.
Yeah.
It's really like, where am I and which of these qualities do I need more of, which will serve me and which will serve the world?
Where do you see in your work the most deficiencies in the wild woman archetype? Like the areas where women could be more wild?
Oh my gosh. Most of us have repressed our wild. We've repressed the adventurous, willing to make experiments and make mistakes. And I feel like that's the wild energy is so much about exploring and being in nature and owning our sexuality and our wildness and our passions and our creativity. And so what I see is a lot of us have, and a lot of times it's because we become mothers or we become responsible or we think we're supposed to be spiritual. And so we start
Mm.
pushing those parts of ourselves down to think, oh, well, that's the young. Now I'm supposed to mature. But we
Right.
lose our juice.
Yeah. I think the adolescent girl has it down to some degree, even though there's a lot of with the good girl syndrome, which that's
Yes.
what phrase came to my mind when we're talking about the wild. Yeah, that sense of adventure, the call to adventure on the heroine's journey or the hero's journey is like you got to activate, right? That inner wild and just give yourself that permission to go exploring and make mistakes. And I think there's this fear. What do you think the fear is of making the mistakes? What do you think that's centered around?
A lot of times it's centered around trying to be perfect, trying to make sure everybody else is happy and that we're pleasing everyone else. And that at core, when we peel down, what's often underneath that is fear of rejection, fear of not being loved, fear of getting in trouble in some way. Like you said, good girl syndrome. Like, if I'm not a good girl, if I'm not making sure that I'm fulfilling my role of keeping everybody else at peace and happy, then I'm going to be abandoned, rejected, then I'm not lovable. And
Mm,
so we often think about, like, stop trying to be perfect for all of us
mm,
and be willing to be messy. And that's what the wise reminds us again, is that being messy is glorious. It's how we learn and it's
mm.
how we play. And that's what keeps us rejuvenated.
I just had no place in my paradigm growing up for what you just said. Like before we started recording, like it has only been in the last 5 years that I have woken up to this call to be messy, not to hurt people, although I did, that was inevitable, but not intentionally.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like for me, and I can only speak from my own experience, is trying to divest myself from that old good girl syndrome type of, or purity culture, or whatever you want to call it. For me, the fear was I'm going to let people down and they're going to leave me. My community is going to leave me. People are going to reject me and then I'll be alone and they won't respect me and they won't understand me. And there's just been this deep need for people to actually understand my intention. And so, for all intents and purposes, 2019, the year I turned 50, was the year that, I mean, maybe in some circles it looked like everything was great. It's the year I actually launched this podcast too, because I felt like I was going to implode if I couldn't get things out. But there was also this messy part of me that no one had seen before because I was really trying to get to the real. I truly, truly only wanted truth and realness. I was done with fake. And when you say yes to that, it looks messy to everyone who had you in a box, who had you on a stage, who had you in their minds of the projection of who they thought you needed to be. And I was just torn with all these. Talk about the stretching. It was tearing too. It was tearing at me. The expectations and then letting people down thing. For me, that's for women. It feels like that's very tied into our worth.
Yeah, and especially when we've been raised to be a particular way and thought that I have value if I do these things that I was told, whether that's becoming a mother and getting married, or whether that's becoming a doctor and, surpassing all the male counterpart, like whatever it is, there's often this outside force that's telling us this is what it means to belong.
Mm,
If you wanna belong, you have to follow this role. And so then there's this fear when you start realizing, "Wait a minute, this doesn't actually feel right in my body." That tear, like you said, of, like, trying to hold it together when you suddenly realize this isn't actually who I am. And that transition process of then letting go and realizing I'm going to disappoint people. I have to. There's no other way. I'm disappointing myself if I stay in the
Yeah.
box that I've put myself in and everybody else is holding me in, or I have to disappoint others. And there comes a point where you just recognize, to live my life, I have to be willing to disappoint others and find a new way of belonging, find new community a lot of times.
Yeah. It feels like your body's intelligence, your soul, what have you, weights and assesses like your degree of readiness for that dark night, or that realization of like, this is a false sense of belonging that I have because I'm not authentically me. I don't have space to explore. I can't live in this paradigm. So I need to stay in to make everyone happy. I thought that was the most spiritual thing to do. And how do you define spirituality? I'm really curious. What's your
Mm.
definition of being authentically spiritual?
Being connected to life
Mm,
in a mindful, I don't want to put the word sacred in there, just being connected, realizing that we're part of this incredible web of beauty
mm,
and that we're each an incredible, unique reflection of the invisible that,
mm.
for me, can't really be named, but can be experienced. So
Yeah.
it's the experience of deep connection to something beyond
Mm.
our own experience.
I love that definition. I think what you said is like, it has to be experiential. Otherwise, it's not real. It's just words on a paper and an old text, or looking outside and seeing the mountains or whatever. But to be in it, I mean, you could call it the old Christian Gnostics or the gnosis or the mystical aspect of your way of being with the world. I kind of like the word mystical in that regard, just because it is experiential, it is direct experience.
Yes.
So what about the willing part of it? So we're saying, okay, now we're accessing this inner wildness, this childlike curiosity, this, I want to go out, because we came here to feel it all, and to experience. So we've given ourselves that permission. Now, where does the willing thing come in after the wild?
Yes. And that comes in that when we start to step into, I want to create things that are sustainable, and that takes choice, it takes some sacrifice, it takes a willingness to go beyond, like, this is going to feel good in the moment, which is connected to wildness, or this is going to be really messy, but that's okay. There's a shift that happens when we step into that willing, where we're like, oh, there's actually consequences to our actions, and there's
Mhm.
choices that need to be made. And so if I'm going to birth a child or a book or a career, it's all about, then I have to show up for that other thing. So it's expanding between just me as this wild being into, now I'm nurturing and birthing something else that needs my energy and my attention. And when we do
Mm.
that, we then start stretching, because it's hard
Yeah.
and we're going to be challenged.
Right.
And that's where the willingness comes in, of like, yep, I'm willing to stay up with my kid all night while they're throwing up and then get up the next day and do it again. I don't know how I'm going
Mhm.
to do this, but I'm willing. I'm
Right.
willing to show up for,
Mhm.
whatever it is.
Yeah. It reminds me of a saying that Oprah always says, like her prayer every morning is, use me, God, use me. It's just like opening to, hey, whatever arises, let it be. It is what it is. And I will embrace it. And that's the word, like when I think about willing, I just like, well, I'm going to embrace it instead of just subsist in it or endure
Yes.
it. Hey, just a little break in our episode to let you know that those of you who were on the wait list for the Women's Wisdom Circle, that registration is now live. So this is a 6-month sacred circle for women wayshowers. We are going to begin our journey on spring equinox, March 19th. We will end our journey on autumnal equinox, September of this year. Go to standspeakshine.com/WWC, or you can just go to my website, CherieBurton.com, and you'll see it there on the homepage to find out more. So excited. I actually slashed the price in less than half of what I was going to charge. And so it will include 20-minute clarity call with me, as well as some fun soul declaration cards that I'll ship to you. You will also get 6 months free of my new Mind, Body, Soul membership. So once again, that's CherieBurton.com or standspeakshine.com/WWC. It's going to be glorious alchemy and transformation. I hope you can join us. So, okay, what about the wisdom? So those things actually then I would assume cultivate the wisdom.
Exactly. Those things cultivate the wisdom. And so as we are finding that joyful, messy wildness, and as we start to really settle into being sustainable and steady and present in our lives fully, that what starts to arise naturally is this more spaciousness in our lives and more compassion. Because we have experiences, and through the experiences, and you don't necessarily become wise with age or even with experience, because I've seen plenty of people become bitter with experience, become more shut down with experience, revert more to not caring about others or closing their hearts. And so wisdom comes when we have experiences and we metabolize them, we integrate, we digest. And what comes out through that digestion and through going through to the other side is more love and compassion and a bigger picture in relationship to ourselves and humans. So our vision opens and we start to see everybody has different experiences and that all of it has beauty and value, and that everything in our lives we can use to deepen our stillness, to bring more love in, even the really rough things.
Beautiful. Yeah, it feels like just listening to you that wisdom is experiential. Like there's knowledge that's like your head, what's in your head, the information you've amassed or the things you've learned, let's just say intellectually, but the wisdom gained from experience is a whole other level of expertise, or I don't even want to say that. Yeah, I look at like the wise woman elder and how I believe, hopefully in my lifetime, by the time I'm very elderly, that we will have embraced that in our culture. I'm Gen X. I'm sure you are too. What is that going to mean? What's your vision for that? What do you see, not just with the feminine, not just with women, but you said you're like, this is about all of us coming together. Do you have a vision for that? What do you see?
Well, my hope is that, we're in this interesting time where, I would say the patriarchy is like going, shit, we're losing control.
Oh no.
Lamp down, right?
Yeah, doubling down.
How do we get everybody back in the box? And the young ones are like, there is no box. Gender's super fluid. There's this expansion and new ways that their brains are wired differently. They're just wired differently, which is great. Yeah. And so my hope and my prayer is that with this rise of energy that's happening now, of breaking free of the old modes of being and the old roles of this, you're supposed to be this, you're supposed to fit into this role. We're evolving, and it's a continuation of the evolution that we've been in, and that we allow it to continue, and that we learn from the young ones and we learn from the ones that have been around for a while, and that we see that there doesn't have to be this huge split, that we can work together.
I feel like the young ones are just like grabbing the popcorn and just like watching it all play out and waiting for their time to show us healthy community en masse, to show us how to come back to what the earth keepers and wise wisdom traditions were trying to point us towards, including Jesus, including the Buddha, including all of these. Yeah. It's like, absolutely. What's the problem here? Like so my kids range in age from 9 to 29, 6 of them. And I've been just looking at the different generational universal aspects to 12-year split between one kid to the other. And it's like Jeff and I kind of just started over with the last two. But anyway, it has been very, very telling because they're challenging all of the paradigms. It was my older children that sort of woke up to some of the shadows and dysfunctions in our religion of origin way before I did. And I was like, wait a minute, what? How did that insight come through for you? I'm like in my 40s. I didn't even go there in my head. So we're preparing this new earth. A lot of people talk about the golden age or the new earth. What does that mean to you? In religion, they call it millennium, but or like Zion or whatever, in lots of Christian, let's just say conservative Christian traditions or the apocalyptic views of Christianity or what have you. And it's coming through in multiple world religions, but it's supposed to be this era of the earth where everybody's like in this place of love and acceptance. But then in my religion of origin, it was like, there's going to be a hierarchy there. And men will have the priesthood and govern this whole thing. Men will still be governing everything with women by their side. So that didn't really feel very golden to me. Never really did.
Yeah.
But I think it starts in the heart, don't you? I think it's like our hearts are being prepared.
Yeah, definitely. And, for me, any religion that puts humans at the top is suspect.
Mm-hmm.
Or like even like golden age for humans. I'm like, we are connected to nature. And for me, where I would love to see us go is to recognize the wisdom of plants as our teachers, and that they are one of the oldest guides that we have, the connection that we have to animals, that we come back into the cycles and the seasons, and that we learn to embrace the dark as much as we embrace the light. Because so much of what we hear is like enlightenment. We're like, there's going to be this beautiful golden time where everybody's going to get along. Bliss.
Bliss
Yeah.
state, inevitable, like internal bliss.
Yeah. And for me, there's a feeling sense of like getting out of being human. And I want to be more here. I want to be more connected to life force and to the ups and downs and the beauty and the grief and the sorrow and the tenderness and the weave of life around, not separate.
So funny, because the conservative religious people they warn you, look out for those people who are like, quote unquote, earth worshipers, the pagans, the tree hugger, whatever, like that put the earth above these leaders or this theology or these paradigms. Like, look out for those people. Their agenda is really like to take you away from God, let's just say. How would you respond to that?
I would say to take away from a male-dominated God, true. To take you away from the divine, it's actually putting you deeply in touch with the divine.
To stay connected to our Mother Earth.
Yes. Yeah.
And these plants.
Of course it's threatening to the major religions.
Yeah.
Because there's no control. You can't control somebody if what their love is cycles and seasons, and they're honoring our deep interdependence with the earth. So often what the religions are saying is we are control and masters of the earth.
That kind of manifests destiny colonization mindset. Okay, let's go back to kind of the segue into, why do religions co-opt? Why do you think there is this effort to sort of keep us out of the earth, or to have this ownership, or to have even a stewardship that could go awry?
Yeah. And so often the major religions are around control. And if you have a group of people that are in relationship with the earth and with the cycles and with the seasons, then that's really hard to control. When
you can't control a volcano and you can't control the weather.
Right, exactly. But they'll try.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so often, like, women have been connected to darkness and the earth and labeled inferior, bad. So like male, light, superior, human, superior, female, inferior, in service to the strong mask, and connected to the earth and the messiness and the darkness. And there's this split. And what we're doing, I believe, is we're saying there is no split, actually. The light and the dark it's all at play, but that's not controllable. It's much easier to control people when you say there's evil that you have to be careful doesn't get you, and we have the salvation and the way. Just look here.
Yeah.
What I would say.
No, go ahead. I have some thoughts on that, but go ahead. What you were.
I think we had posed a question earlier of like, what would you say to somebody that was like, don't go towards the earth, if that's where
that'll get you. That's like it's down. You're on the gray slide to hell right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And really what it is an opening into connecting to the divine rather than really remote God. That is often the way that the major religions see it, as like the God is out here and there needs to be an intermediary for you to connect with God. And when you start to say there actually doesn't have to be a mediator, you can go direct.
Right.
Can't control that.
That is the wrestle right there. To someone who was raised in a very high demand religion, I will tell you that is a massive wrestle. And I think it's not just in religion. I think it's in the space of government and academia and a lot of these institutions or systems that have perpetuated and indoctrinated people in their disempowerment, in their reliance on the systems. And you were saying, like, the whole thing about the earth is to bring us back home to our senses, is to bring us back home literally to our own hearts and our own bodies. So my fascination of late is really giving people, like, there's a lot of people who start to deconstruct from this stuff, but they don't really understand what they're building now. Where are we going? Where is this taking us? How are we coming into communion with all that is? And then how do we ground into what's taking place? Because it's going to get a lot worse. I've seen so many things come up in the media of deception and abuse of power and sexual abuse cover-ups and all the things. Really, charismatic leadership gone awry, honestly. And that's going to be happening more and more as these shadows are exposed. And you could call it patriarchy, you could call it a lot of things. But yeah, so how do we ground into the new reality, into the actual reality? What are some practical ways, or how would you coach, let's say, somebody into who's just feeling that fear, or where are we headed? What's happening? What can we know? What's
Yeah.
real?
Yeah, such a good question. So, two things come up when you share that is one is, people often will say to me, okay, is it getting worse or is it getting better? Like, are things going to get better or worse? And I always say, who knows? What we want to do is learn how to get absolutely present with what's arising and be heart centered and what I think of as unconditional in our relationship with life. So, what we're trained in is very much conditional living and conditional love. And what that means to me is like, I'll love you if,
Right.
right? You'll be accepted if. And we
Mm-hmm.
do this to ourselves and we do this to each other in huge ways. So, I'll accept myself if I fit into this role, or I lose 20 pounds, or I have the thing think I'm supposed to have. And again, it's another form of perfectionism. Like, there's this image of who we think we're supposed to be. And then we judge ourselves against that image constantly instead of being in relationship with this being fully.
Yeah.
So, where we're moving towards is learning what being unconditional actually means and undoing the paradigm of judgment and separation and victimization in the form of, if there's a judge, there has to be a victim,
Mm-hmm.
and undoing like the punishment model is how I think of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
More just there's consequences for our actions.
Mm-hmm.
When we take responsibility, we understand that, and this is where the wisdom comes from, there's consequences, which means I wanted to be mindful of my choices. I can't control other people's choices or other people's responses, but I can be more mindful of how to be more unconditional in relationship to self and others. And that includes making clear boundaries. Sometimes people think about unconditional and they're like, that means just loving everybody no matter what. It's like, yes, it means learning how to love people and how to make boundaries and how to speak your truth and how to be really clear
How to be
about
wild.
where you're energy. Yeah. So
Keep
that I
on.
feel like that's what we're moving towards.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. I have similar sentiments, although you've articulated it really well, in terms of, where I'm at with that too. It's just, I foresee a time, and I'm grounded and anchored in hope here, that we are rapidly moving towards this, although the pendulum is definitely swinging and a lot's coming to the surface. But I have held space in my own being, in my own mind and heart, for this vision of a world that just understands and really sees people, doesn't see their bodies, like sees their souls, sees them for who they are, in their messiness, in their humanness, as you say, and also like their divinity or their sacredness, or whatever that word is, the purity of intent, the infinitesimal worth that each person has. I still work on these prejudices and biases within myself. I recognize a lot of it as programming, very early programming, but I also recognize that at some point I have to be unconditional. I have to practice what I preach. I have to not teach it because that's my natural thing to do, or to coach people on it, but to actually be with myself that way, So, as we kind of round our discussion out, HeatherAsh, this has been so great. I would love for you to share with our listeners ways of being with that you've seen in terms of unconditional self-regard, or, because it does start with us. What are some ways that you've seen are effective with people, women, let's just say, as that's, the lion's share of your work, practicing that?
No, that one of the first ways is, like you said, is that we're often so conditional with ourselves. And so when we turn within, to have the willingness to go through the process of learning how to be in relationship with ourselves in different ways, of learning to see, and I think about it's really the foundation is awareness. And the awareness is, how am I talking to myself? How am I viewing how am I in relationship to my body? And I think all of us there's four aspects. There's our mental body, our emotional, our energetic, and our physical body. And so coming into harmonious right relationship with these aspects of selves, unconditional, is becoming aware of how are we treating ourselves, and then raising more energy to change the old patterns and behavior. So the
Mm,
awareness helps us to start to see, but we
mm,
then need energy to change. And that's really a lot of what my work is helping people become more aware, but then also look at where they're losing energy to bring that energy back so that instead of then going into judgment, it's like, whoa, 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 come back, stop, take a breath. All right, where do I want my attention to go? And it's
mm.
a whole undoing in a
Yeah.
beautiful way.
I wish they would
And one of
teach
the
this in elementary schools, this
oh my
process.
god. I know, me too, me too,
And
and
in
one
churches,
yeah, just everywhere.
everywhere.
But one of my favorite, really simple tools is this idea that what most of us get trapped in, we can say, is our mind starts judging us, and then we judge ourselves because we're judging, because we know we shouldn't be judging ourselves, and then we beat ourselves up, and then we feel victimized because it's not my fault that I'm judging myself. I had this really hard childhood, and we can get into these whole run-on sentences, or what I call disaster mind, where we start beating ourselves up for things that happened in the past, or worrying or judging ourselves for things in the future.
Which is like
And a lot
depression and
of us
anxiety spectrum, right?
totally, totally. And our mind is loves making disasters up and looking at worst case scenarios. And so if we can start thinking about, like, our minds tend towards run-on sentences, and we want to get better at punctuation. That
Mm,
anytime we see our mind going into worry or anxiety or punishing ourselves for something in the past, that we just go, period.
mm,
What I love to do is then go, hi, sweetheart, right here. Like, come here, like
mm,
gentle sweetness, period. Come back.
mm.
And that lands us in the present and opens our heart again. And then usually the mind takes off again. And then you're like, nope, come back, sweetheart. And to really feel, where do we want to put our attention? And I love what you said of that you have a vision of how we could be in relationship with each other and ourselves. And I think each of us individually needs to find what that vision is of what we're yearning for,
Mhm.
and then capture our own attention, period. Hi, sweetheart. Put our attention where we want it to go.
Mm.
It takes practice.
That's just so clear the way that you describe that. And it also feels like, okay, if it starts with the individual instead of us trying to go fix and, have pickets, and those are great. Activism is amazing. It really is. But the real revolution is going to come within how people, the way that they rest into themselves and don't take all of this internal energy of this, like the warrior and the, like, let's fight. This is not right. This is, and taking all of that and just sitting with that tension and letting it work in us alchemically, and then get grounded enough to be a force of real revolutionary change in the world, which is not anger. It's more collaborative and more invitational. And that's the world I see. This, I don't know, it's like, think Knights Templar with, multiple faces and voices and genders and like, it's like we are all in this together. I've got you, you've got me. Let's all talk about this. And I think that that's the element that's been missing in patriarchy, is that it's not including all voices. That is what has gotten us into this mess. It's like you said, you're either with us or you're against us. You either believe like we do or you don't belong. You either perform to these standards or you're not, quote unquote, worthy enough to be part of our group.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
any other thoughts around that? We wrap up and then you can share with our listeners where to find you online and all your glorious things that you're doing and all of that.
The one last thing is one of the things I've been really studying is indigenous wisdom and how there's new methods that are coming forward that are old methods, but that of like there's a lot of wounding that we're navigating, all of us, around a lot of things. But that there's this idea of instead of exactly what you said, like instead of when you have like a perpetrator and a victim, what we tend to do is say the perpetrator must get punished.
Mm,
And what indigenous communities are saying, well, wait a minute, we're dealing with a lot of wounding from colonialism and breakdown of our societies. And to then just put the perpetrator out doesn't actually heal anything. It just keeps it going. And so what's starting to happen in some of these communities, and I think this is a model of where we get to go, which is really messy and difficult, but it's the way forward, is everybody gets brought in. Everybody goes into ceremony. Everybody heals. And that there's a like, how do we all heal together, understanding that everybody's hurt here.
mm,
Everybody's hurt here. And so that's a really deep come to the table. Let's bring everybody to the table and figure out how to do it. And it's hard to even think about how to conceive that, but we start in our families.
yeah.
You know, we start with our chosen families. We start with learning how to communicate with each other in new ways.
Yeah. And the new way is just deep listening. That is what the feminine really is, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, Heather Ash, this has been so amazing. Can you tell our listeners the best place to find you online and what you're currently all about? Besides waiting for your amazing book to come out, which I can't wait to read.
Warriorgoddess.com is the website, and I'm on like all the social media pretty much. And I have a new Substack, so that's where I'm putting my writing energy into. This is so fun. It's called Out of the Fire, Dancing with the Contradictions
Ooh.
of Life. So yeah, I went through a big wildfire last year, and it kind of
Mm,
created a lot of just a big shift in my life. And so that's where I'm pouring my energy right now. So that's at substack.heatherash or heatherash.substack.com. It's
mm.
a great place to connect with me as
Well, your
well.
writing certainly does speak to the soul, and your work is very integral, especially at this time. I'm glad that was one of the gifts of COVID, is that a lot of people just rested into their real work in the world and wanted to be part of the solution, if you will. So thank you for your work, and thank you for taking the time with us today.
Thank you so much, Sheree, for all that you're bringing and the gifts. And what a beautiful interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope this episode has shed some light on the critical notion of embracing your wild side, your wild archetype. You know, challenging socially prescribed roles, really just awakening to more authentic ways of living in your body, in nature, and in your natural everyday environment. I love what Heather and I explored around the vision of a new heart-centered earth and just a return to Mother Nature wisdom. Love it. So watch for her upcoming book, Wild, Willing, and Wise. Her website is HeatherAshAmara.com. You can also follow her on Instagram at HeatherAsh Amara. Follow me on Instagram at Sheree.Burton. And remember to ask to join our new private Facebook group, the Soul Rose Community, where we do free monthly live mini classes the second Monday of every month. Thanks again for listening. Stay tuned. More yumminess to come. Our next episode is super juicy. You're going to love it. Talk to you soon. And thank you so much for listening to this premiere episode of The Soul Rose Show.